Hello and welcome back to Bad Canadians. I'm your host, Jared Michael. Here at Bad Canadians, we attempt to understand Canada's contrarians. We believe contrarians are sometimes the only people holding valuable information the rest of society desperately needs. All right, very excited to come back to this new season with Dr. Lawrence Krauss. He's the internationally renowned theoretical physicist, lecturer, educator, and best-selling author of 12 popular books, including The Physics of Star Trek and A Universe from Nothing. He's also the founder and president of the Origins Project and the host of the Origins podcast, where he regularly sits down and talks to some of the world's greatest intellectuals. He's on Bad Canadians today to discuss his new book, The War on Science. It's a collection of 39 different academics and scholars and scientists from across a wide array of disciplines. And they are all on here saying some version of the same thing, which is we're having a hard time doing good science with this new progressive ideology. What I found powerful about this book is how accessible it is. You can just before dinner dip into an essay and instantly be involved in the conversation with such a diverse array of disciplines. There's probably a subject matter here you're naturally interested in. And, Lawrence Krauss, he's a very unique individual in that he practices what he preaches. He believes in free speech, open inquiry, and questioning everything. And I knew this going into the conversation. And so about halfway through, I kind of gently nudged us into a place of respectful, friendly disagreement. And, we still ended our podcast laughing and having fun. And I think that's just proof to show that we don't have to go scorched earth on each other when disagreeing. I love the conversation. I'm very happy and respectful and grateful that Dr. Krauss gave us the time to come on Bad Canadians. I hope you like the conversation too. Without further ado, Dr. Lawrence Krauss. Dr. Lawrence Krauss, welcome to Bad Canadians. It's an honor to have you on the show here.
I'm happy to be a bad Canadian.
Is it okay if respectfully I refer to you as Lawrence going forward?
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, hey, first of all, congratulations on birthing a new book. That's always something to be proud of.
Yeah, this one was like herding cats because usually when I write a book, I just have to control myself. But in this case, 39 people, 38 other people. So that was...
Yeah, I got to say, it was a great compilation of amazing group of people, just fantastic essays. It's got to be one of the most valuable books out there right now on the shelves. But despite the scariness and seriousness of the topic at hand in the book, I couldn't help but feel pretty excited and hopeful and optimistic reading it, in the sense that I think for me it was just hearing 39 world famous scientists across so many disciplines, from medicine to biology, philosophy, mathematics, physics, all saying some version of the same thing, which is we can't do good science with this new ideology. And, I live on an island off the West Coast, and, most of my life is spent in left of center cultural circles still. And I think overwhelmingly, there's still a sense that when people hear the word woke or ideology, that there's a lot of skepticism around that claim. And I think most people kind of in that circles kind of think woke is referring to maybe the natural excesses of the left and is not reflective of the core philosophy of the movement at all. Where I think you and these 38 other scientists are making the exact opposite argument, that this is actually a somewhat coherent collection of ideas that deserves to be treated like any other ideology, like Marxism, socialism, communism. It just happens to have it's newer, so it's not exactly those things, so it doesn't have quite a name we've all agreed upon yet. So I'm just wondering, I'm curious, after talking to 38 other scientists from such a diverse background, did you glean any information on why it's so difficult to get people to see this ideology for what it is?
Well, I think people reflect on that in the pieces they wrote in the book. I mean, you hit a nail on the head, by the way, that I worked very hard to get a diversity of disciplines. So this is across the spectrum. It's not just physics or even the hard sciences and math. We even have someone from classics, and I can explain that later if you want. But and also from all political persuasions, because I didn't want this to be attacked viewed as a right-wing attack on science or left-wing. And they're also all in academia, because there are a lot of good people writing outside academia, but I didn't want this to be an outside criticism of what's going on. I wanted people to see that people inside are concerned, with the hope that if we spoke out, that our colleagues around the country would do this. And I think that hits on one of the points that I think you just asked, really. I think, first of all, most academics, and certainly most scientists, just keep their head down and don't even think about it. They may think of it as nonsense. They just want to go out and do their own work, and they don't want to be bothered with it, so they just stay below the radar and don't worry about it. And now, of course, they're reaping the penance of that in some sense. The other group are afraid. They recognize the problems, but there are people here who have been canceled for asking questions, and so there are reasons to be afraid about asking or raising questions about whether, you know, hiring someone on the basis of their sex or their gender or racial group is better than on the basis of merit. Just asking that question in a faculty meeting can get you censured, or in some cases fired, and
Right.
it's scary. So I think, but it has. So that's one of the reasons it really hasn't taken hold to the extent that it appears to take hold, except that universities, in response to a wide variety of things over years, and being prompted after the George Floyd incident in the United States, have built up these bureaucracies called DEI bureaucracies, that diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that sounds innocuous, right? Who could be against diversity, equity, and inclusion? Except those buzzwords don't mean what they say. Inclusion in this case means exclusion. Equity doesn't mean equal opportunity, it means equal outcomes, which of course is not something you need or should ever, in fact, try to expect in a society of people of different talents. And then diversity really in this case means discrimination, reverse discrimination. And so, but it sounds nice, and a lot of people don't want to argue with it because it sounds like, who could be against those things? But those bureaucracies have taken over a lot of universities. And so the decisions of what's going on are not being made by the academics, not being made by faculty. And then you have the real problem that university leaders and academic leaders and scientific leaders would rather kowtow to what the social justice mobs than stand up for academic integrity. They used to be academics, and now they're mostly salesmen. University presidents are trying
Right.
to raise money. And so that's, by the way, another thing. We want to not just reach the academics, but when we reach the public here about the internal culture war, there's an external war going on too, which we can talk about, especially in the United States. But when the public reads this, my hope is that they will be energized to not only speak out about the government doing some crazy things, like mandating who can get endowed chairs based on sex or gender, and restricting white males, excluding them, but also, they can vote with their feet. They can choose not to donate to universities that that are behaving this way, or not send their kids to them. So that's the way I think to eventually get the university leaders and academic leaders to notice anything, because they're just happy to virtue signal, even when they don't mean it, in a very patronizing way. So, but in any case, I think this thing built up with this bureaucracy that grew and eventually took control like a cancer of institutions. And then you have leaders, including government leaders, who are so sensitive to social justice activists that they would rather restrict things like free speech than to have a mob attack them for any other reason.
Right. So there's a bit of mob mentality going on here, I guess.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of mob mentality and a lack of backbone and fear, and and the road to hell is paved with good intention. And I think originally the intent was to address real inequities in society, but it just got out of hand.
And how much of this is linked to the shift in, let's say, academia going over, a couple generations from being more academic, truth focused to developing a bit more of a corporate business model? Has that weakened the backbone?
A corporate business model is one of the reasons why university leaders are acting more like public relations people than guardians of scholarship. But I think it's also we're also, unfortunately, partly because of this self-selection process of what's going on, is we're seeing various academic departments deciding that they need to be activists rather than scholars. One of the epigraphs for the book was from Lawrence Summers, the former president of Harvard University, who said universities need to abandon the concept that they have a central role in moral education. And what you're seeing is universities making political statements, deciding they should say what's right and wrong. Universities aren't supposed to decide what's right and wrong. They're supposed to educate people to think and then and question. And then hopefully if you think and question and look at evidence, you'll be able to get a better idea of what's right and wrong. But to sidestep that and just say this is wrong, or we think this is not in the core value of the university, or people shouldn't be questioning whether indigenous knowledge is equivalent to modern astronomy. Um, that kind of ideology, that kind of dogma, is dangerous.
Well, I wonder, could you speak to a bit about the difference, let's say, between activism versus being an advocate? Because I know, like, for me, I was a bit of a left-wing echo chamber for most of my life. And I've noticed coming out of it and trying to listen to people I normally was ignoring and trying to listen to people from across the divide, it took me a while just to get past language. Because, I associated the word activist as nothing but positive.
Yeah.
And so just the moment I'd hear someone speak about an activist in a negative or critical way, I was like, I was uncomfortable with that. And what's wrong with activism? Don't we want to make the world a better place? And so could you speak to the subtle difference in academia between focusing on activism versus, let's say, the truth or advocating?
Well, look, I mean, it's fine for individuals to be activists and be motivated to do things. What's important is that the institution, what does the institution represent? And the academic institutions and scholarship in general is not supposed to basically pick a political perspective. Universities should not be making political statements. University professors can, and as far as I'm concerned, in terms of freedom of speech, they can say anything they want if they're representing themselves and not the university. And I think they shouldn't be punished for that. But saying that the university is taking a position on a presidential election in the States, or take a position that sexism is endemic in society, which is a political position, and in fact, it's when it comes to universities, it's totally untrue. And so I think I've been an activist much of my life too, and much sometimes to the chagrin of my university when I speak out on different things, and that's fine. I think that's okay. But when one of the writers in this book, Abigail Thompson, is a mathematician, and she's talking about her university again in the States. There are 8 of these authors who are Canadian, I should say. Well, hopefully, all bad Canadians. But anyway, or badass Canadians anyway. But Abigail Thompson is a mathematician at Irvine, and she points out that several departments, like I think it's Latin American Studies or something, in their webpage, they say a degree in Latin American Studies is a degree in social justice activism. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's not. You'd think they'd say it's learning about the culture and history of the rich history and culture of Latin American countries and blah blah blah. That's scholarship, but a department should not be politically activist, because politics just gets in the way of scholarship. It's a great topic for discussion. And obviously, in a political science course, you can discuss political issues. But once again, a political science course, of which there for all I know there may be some, I don't know one, that would say saying there's 2 sexes means you're transphobic.
Yeah.
It would not be appropriate. And in fact, a professor or a class can ask that question, and it can be debated. And I would encourage it to be debated, but it should not be the official policy of an academic institution, and that's the key difference. And similarly with government or even scientific institutions, the American Physical Society, of which I'm a member, and many Canadians are members that were physicists, at one point came out and said that made a statement as physicists that an executive order of Donald Trump back in his first administration was against the whole spirit and ethos of the American Physical Society, and the executive order said that people should be hired that what should matter is not the color of someone's skin, but the quality of their character. Somehow that
Yeah.
was an anathema to the American Physical Society. That kind of political, or having a strike for Black lives at the American Physical Society, that's not appropriate.
Right, right. I came to see it, and tell me if this is correct or not, like in a way of that so many of the universities seem to have truth kind of as a central, searching for the truth, and this idea of being open and not having a consensus or too harsh of a consensus around things. Always anything could be challenged. And it always felt like activism starts with the idea that the truth has been settled. And now you just have to go out and make it so. And it doesn't seem like that belongs in the academy.
Well, and that's the same with religion. That's why I've argued against religion for a long time. I think for the same reason, you can't have the answers before you ask the questions. And
Yeah.
dogma is literally that. The truth is settled, and we cannot discuss it. Certain ideas are sacred, and they cannot be debated. In academia, and in my opinion, in society more generally, but especially in academia, nothing should be sacred.
Right. Yeah.
Everything should be subject to question and debate. In fact, not only is it should be, but it's essential,
Hmm.
because without that debate, there's no progress, especially in science, but even in other areas of academic scholarship. Science itself is a social discipline that requires dialectic. It requires, you publish something, you expect people to attack it and question it, and and only the good ideas survive that whole process.
It seems like if we had been allowed, if the universities had been operating properly the last, like, let's say 15 years, and we were debating these new ideas like equity, like anti-racism, like all these new concepts coming in, it feels like one of the debates I feel like we should have been drilling right in on. Like I read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. It's the Bible of anti-racism. I think her contribution to the subject is the concept of white fragility, but the rest of the book is just the basic concepts of anti-racism. And she explicitly goes after objectivity in the book. She
Yeah,
states that objectivity is, and that seems,
it's all based on you said it's new, but it's not. It's all based on postmodernism.
yeah, the postmodern critique on objectivity.
All knowledge has to be viewed in terms of power relationships and oppression, conflict and victimization, power and oppression. So no knowledge can be is objective, and that whole notion is an anathema again to science.
Yeah.
Where the orbital frequency of a satellite around the planet does not depend at all on oppression or who says it and which country's shooting the satellite up. And if you take a ball, it's going to drop at 10 meters per second squared approximately, no matter what. And mathematics, there's these cries to decolonize mathematics. And in Canada, one of the things I talk about is the Canadian government funded an initiative. I think it's or Cordy, I'm not sure, but called Decolonizing Light. What a stupid thing. I mean, light electromagnetism is one of the greatest physical theories of all time, and it's a great triumph for the human intellect. And maybe the fact that it was developed in Europe doesn't mean it excludes anyone else. And then they even went further and said, one of the problems is physics is too difficult, so we have to do something about that. The mathematics is too difficult, and of course it's not only patronizing, but it's essentially racist, right? It's saying that some people can't do it, so we have to water it down. So it's not, this white supremacy of mathematics has to be watered down so that it's accessible to everyone. And mathematics is mathematics, and when there's a paper in a physics journal that came out recently about the intrinsic whiteness of physics, saying that the use of whiteboards is an example of white supremacy. This is just nonsense, and and it 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 totally, this notion of the subjectivity of knowledge, the fact that all things have to be viewed in terms of power and oppression, that there are intrinsically oppressed peoples, that there must be sexism and racism, that any any disparity between the background demographics of society and the level of people in a certain occupation represents sexism or racism, which is just not true. And certainly, if you make that claim, you have to demonstrate it, and there's no evidence of that. And moreover, it's ridiculous to argue that if the applicant pool in a certain, as Canadian government has done with Canada Research Shares, the highest endowed share the government gives out, they've said that they have to have exactly the same background demographics as society. So there'd be 50.9 female percent and a certain number minority and a certain number indigenous and all this stuff. Well, it's just ridiculous because it causes places like the University of Toronto and other places to now say, we will not consider white males for these positions for the next 5 years. But the point is, if the applicant pool has, if the applicant pool in a certain field has no Indigenous people, or maybe you want 5% Indigenous people, and you acquire 5% Indigenous there, you accept them all, and not anyone in any other field, it's clearly you're doing disservice to the field because you're not doing it on merit, and you're also doing a disservice to the individuals because again, you put an asterisk next to their name, and forever they're going to be people are going to wonder did they get the job because they were qualified or because of the color of their skin or their gender or whatever else it is that whatever else identity chose them, that's a disaster for merit in general and for academia beyond that.
Yeah, and that seems to be going across every industry, every discipline where merit is being put second to everything. Am I wrong in remembering? I thought there was a couple of years where Canada announced to government that no scientific funding would go to white male researchers.
Well, effectively, that's what's happening in the Canada research chairs now, because certain fields are dominated by males, and that's just the way it is, and it's that way in countries like in Scandinavia, which have incredible gender equity, and but people choose different fields for different reasons, and so if you've already had more than 50% of your Canada research chairs in a given field to white males, you can't hire anymore,
right? Yeah.
Regardless of the quality of the pool.
Yeah,
and that's what's happening. That's why the University of Toronto has done that, and not the only. There's other major research universities that have done that, and it's a disservice to the field. It's a disservice to the people, and a disservice to the country.
Yeah. I think one of your authors is Carol Hooven. She's one of the essay authors in there, right? And she's is she a biology professor who left Harvard?
She was a professor. She was a lecturer in evolutionary biology, basically.
She left Harvard because she stated
she was also head of their graduate program.
And she stated there are two sexes.
She in one of her first, I think, media appearances, she wrote a book on testosterone, which is a very good book, and also her field is sort of sex and evolutionary biology, her field of research, and so she was asked to go on Fox and said, there are two sexes. At which point, after enough time, the environment became so unbearable for her without any support in the department that she basically had to resign.
And so I saw she posted earlier last week, The Lancet had published an article that was basically making the claim that just making the statement she made is officially transphobic. And so how does the Lancet get to a place where they're publishing this stuff?
Well, that's what you begin to worry when the journals and the medical journals have fallen hook, line, and sinker into this notion that sex and gender are not different, or that making claims are harmful, and even beyond that, to the claims that the journals basically and the associations like the American Medical Association, and I think the one in Canada as well, are basically saying that making claims about gender affirming care for youngsters that are just patently wrong and not supported by the literature, but they're making them. And then even worse, Lancet is social justice. As I say, these journals have come out and said, even if something's right, if it's offensive to a certain group, even if the science is right, we will not publish it.
Yeah.
Well, that's an anathema to science. But then Canadian Medical Association, the CanMeds, their proposed education program for the future, specifically said that in the education of doctors, social justice concerns should take priority over medical knowledge.
Right. Yeah.
Now, I think most people who go to a doctor would much rather the doctor know some medicine than be very, very sympathetic to the people or their backgrounds. I mean, it's nice to have a nice doctor, but it's nice that they know something too.
Yeah. Well, hey, Lawrence, you're a rare bird in that I think you're someone who genuinely enjoys going to places of friendly, respectful disagreement rather than having an hour-long love fest. And so, I thought maybe I would nudge us over to maybe a couple places where maybe, there's slight...
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll interpret it. I thought I might start with a tiny, minute critique of something. I had a visceral reaction when reading the Richard Dawkins essay in The War on Science.
Okay.
And so I thought I'd just mention one little thing in there. And if we survive that exchange, then maybe I'd pitch a more general contrarian science take at you and see what you think of it.
Richard generates a lot of enthusiasm of both sides.
Well, this is not a dunk on Richard Dawkins. The man's a genius. He's one of the most careful thinkers on the planet. So, I'm not going there by any means with him. But I was, his essay's phenomenal. It's a tour de force. It starts the book off. It sets the tone perfectly. He goes to great lengths to really show how gender ideology is fundamentally anti-science and it is raising the subjective over the objective reality. And I love how he parallels that with the story of how a similar ideology in the Soviet Union in the 20th century, bled its way into the science of agriculture and directly led to the, death of millions of Russians and Chinese people. And just to show how serious we have to take these things, and so, yeah, the essay itself is absolutely beautiful. But when reading this one line, I did actually have a literal visceral reaction. And so I'll walk you through my analysis of it, and then you tell me what you don't like about it or like about it. And so this is the line. It's when he's talking about President Trump signing the executive order. And he has a line where he says, "The otherwise loathsome President Trump made the upholding of biological maleness and femaleness the subject of an executive order as one of his first actions after taking office." And then in parenthesis, he adds, "perhaps the only good thing he has ever done." And so in the context of free speech, when I read that parenthesis, it kind of hit me in a certain way. And I've come to love Richard Dawkins' parenthesis. It's something he regularly has in his writing. There's often biting humor, British, comedy in there. And a lot of his personality comes through in those so I've grown to love them. Nothing against the parenthesis. But in free speech, there's this idea with complicated individuals like Donald Trump or Justin Trudeau or anybody that there's kind of three ways you can talk about them. One is that, this kind of hero worship, loyal follower, this person's on the right side of history. Any focusing on their shortcomings is disingenuous. I'm not having it. The second one is kind of this man is a monster. He's a complete buffoon, an idiot. Anything he gets right is by accident. And the third one is this is a complicated human being in a complex setting and we'll call the balls and strikes as they come over the plate, and I couldn't help but feel, and when I started analyzing that line, that I felt that parenthesis, it kind of came across as a little unreasonable for a man like Richard Dawkins, that it was a little too far, and it kind of felt like it was slipping into that second camp, whereas he could have said something as far as I wouldn't mind if Donald Trump passed away in his sleep, but credit where credit is due, and that would ring true to me. I could believe Richard Dawkins, but I'm sure Richard Dawkins was just as happy when President Trump signed the executive order against the diversity, equity, inclusion in the federal government. So I just don't feel that statement rings true for arguably the most reasonable man on the planet. So just to wrap up my thought here, though.
Look, I think there's hyperbole there, and I think he was reflecting an emotion. It's easy to despise Donald Trump. He's a human being, but I don't know if there was malice aforethought here, but I'm going to, and I'll have to ask Richard.
My concern is it's the kind of line that gives people permission just to say, oh, this guy's being unreasonable. I don't have to listen to the rest of his argument.
But I'll tell you what, I just saw a hit piece on the book arguing that we were all right-wing. We'd all become right-wing, ideologues. Okay.
Yeah.
I suspect that maybe Richard put that in to point out that he's not part of the Republican agenda.
Lawrence, let me finish my thought then too, because another thing I'll say is I recognize the fact that a man like Richard Dawkins needs to separate himself from extremists. And by love him or hate him, whatever you think of Donald Trump, by any definition of the word of extremist, I think he is an extremist. And so I could see the need, he has extreme ways. So I could see that you want to separate yourself from that guy.
Sociopath and all the rest. But anyway.
Yeah, so that was just a little thing that hit me a little, because, in a couple sentences earlier, he's rightfully calling out the American Medical Association for virtue signaling for, in their medicine, acknowledging biological sex so people don't die. But in their public facing social media accounts, they're always mouthing the words of gender ideology. And he rightfully calls them out for that. But I'd argue that kind of virtual signaling is actually a form of tribal signaling. And so it kind of felt like Richard Dawkins accidentally slipped into, critiquing tribal signaling. And my takeaway from that was not critiquing Richard Dawkins. It was my God, this obviously, if the thoughtful thinker is Richard Dawkins could accidentally slip into that, it shows how vigilant all of us need to be when bringing have our biases, our blind spots, our preconceived notions, and how if we as individuals want to make the world a better place, one of the best things we can do is address that thing we're doing, address our biases, try to see our blind spots, try to challenge our preconceived notions. And and
people like you who, and that's the point of free speech, is not to give you a chance to speak. It's to give me or Richard Dawkins a chance to hear you, to say, oh yeah, maybe that was wrong. So I think that's the way you address your biases, is being open to hearing and listening to people you may despise or disagree with. I think you're right. I mean, all of us, I think, even heaven forbid, I might have indulged in hyperbole to raise attention. But I think I think that for many reasons that Richard Dawkins finds Donald Trump and his administration largely despicable. And you're right. The statement that he's never done anything else right, even a broken clock is right twice a day, and there's at least 2 or 3 things that Donald Trump has done that are right. Maybe 4. I remember when I had a podcast with my friend Noam Chomsky, who is no friend of Donald Trump's, but he pointed out, he said, I think Donald Trump, by actually meeting with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, was the right thing to do. To actually meet these people is a good thing. And I think so. Yeah, there's no doubt, and I'm sure Richard would say mea culpa if you approached him about it.
Well, that's very well. Here, maybe I'll pitch the larger contrarian science take on you. I wish I could
disagree with you more on it, but I don't.
Well, that's fair. That's very fair of you. I appreciate it. The bigger, it fits into the kind of the ethos of my podcast, The Bad Canadians. In my introduction video about contrarians, I have a line where it says, throughout from the beginning of science, there has been people that have been treated like heretics and pariahs until they're better understood, and then they're elevated to the position of pioneers and brave champions. And I think the current moment is no different. That's still, that's been all through. Like the first essay I read in your book was the Elizabeth Weiss, actually, because I have a hobby interest in this early settling of the Americas. And so I'm not sure if you're familiar with that Clovis first paradigm that held in from the 1930s until literally the 2010s. This paradigm held, and the critics, there is this idea that the Clovis culture was the first culture to come into the Americas, and anything before that didn't happen. And the reality is they'd say, well, there's no science against this. There's nothing you can hold up that's against this. But the reality is they held back all funding. They wouldn't let anybody dig under the Younger Dryas, archaeological layer. And so I guess I'm of the mind that I'm not sure I've seen science as an institution build enough safeguards in to protect against that human tendencies that come up of pride and ego, gatekeeping. And so I've always wondered, just in a bubble, like there's all the issues with public science funding, there's not enough money, we should have more of it, all that stuff. But in a bubble, I wondered if public science funding could be similar to investment portfolios, where a certain percentage, like a single digit percentage, maybe 3, 4, 5%, was reserved and mandatorily had to go towards the more fringe topics that the majority of the people in that discipline don't want to spend money on because they think it's a waste of time. But I thought it'd give us an opportunity to get those high risk, high reward, paradigm shattering discoveries. It would also give us an opportunity to win over some public trust because it's public money, and people would see that the beliefs that they are interested in are at least getting explored to some degree. And then I also wondered if it could also help dial the personal biases of scientists themselves to focus less on demonizing people for what they study and saving that scorn more for people who are trying to pass bad science off as evidence, and and just saving the scorn for that.
Well, look, I'll comment. I disagree with you on some aspects of this.
Yeah, you go.
In order to do this, you got to have a lot of money. And DARPA, the defense agency, does this. They have something called DARPA. And DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agencies, funds nuts 80% of the time, in my opinion.
Sorry, I missed your line there. What?
Because their idea is, well, these are really out-of-the-box things, and most of them are going to fail. But if one of them helps us detect neutrinos from submarines, which would change the whole strategic infrastructure because we're able to know where submarines are, then it's worth it. It's worth funding 100 crackpots. But and because they can do that because they basically have infinite amount of money.
Right, right.
Regular science agencies don't. And when you first made your discussion about heretics, I had this discussion with someone earlier today, and I get ever since I became a well-known scientist, I get lots of crackpot. I used to get crackpot letters. Now I get crackpot emails, at least 2 a day with theories universe. But my favorite ones are the ones that say, all my friends think I'm crazy. Everyone I've talked to thinks I'm crazy. But everyone thought Einstein was crazy. So therefore I'm Einstein.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That most heretics and nuts are nuts.
Yes, yes, it's
And
true.
the virtue of being a heretic doesn't make you right.
No.
You're often wrong. So that is no badge of honor in that sense alone. Your willingness to follow ideas might be, but it's no badge of correctness. And so I think in areas where there is limited funding, and that includes most of science, really the amount of funding that goes in, you have to be very careful to choose things. I think in some sense you have to ask the question, what's most likely to succeed, and which individuals have a track record that are most likely to succeed. And it's unfortunate, but I think you have to do that. If you had enough money, you could have a DARPA in every field, but we don't. Um, and I think um, setting aside 5%, we set aside 10% of the National Science Foundation for DEI. Okay,
Wow, look at that waste of money.
money exactly. And so it's true. I'd rather them fund crackpots, but then the problem is that generally, I can tell within a sentence. Generally, when I get these papers, that they don't make sense, or that the author doesn't understand, doesn't have the intellectual baggage to address the problem when they tell me they have a new theory of gravity or a new theory of that. And so I think it is true, and it is true that scientists are people and they have biases and they're fads, but the scientific process is designed to overcome that. It's designed to recognize that scientists are biased, so that there is a dialectic, so that when you put something out, it's questioned. And all those heretics who are now well known are well known because the scientific process worked.
But we don't know how many never got discovered.
What was that?
We don't know how many of them never got discovered, and
We
how
do.
many.
We do.
Yeah.
And the question is whether you err on what side you err on. But there's so much evidence of so many heretics who eventually, or people with heretical ideas, who have eventually been vindicated because the scientific process works. If your heretical idea works better than other ideas, while it may be harder to get through the community and get a job, and and suffer the slings and arrows, uh, if it works, science will eventually find that out, and the process overcomes the fact that science is a sociological activity and scientists have biases, and that's the key point. It's a scientific process which requires free and open debate and questioning and experimentation and empirical evidence and re-questioning and retesting and re-debate that makes it work. And when you try and bypass that by saying no, this is the truth, then you have the real problems. And so yes, scientists are biased, but science itself isn't, because science itself overcomes those biases.
And so you don't see a need to have to build things into the institution itself to safeguard against the personal biases. Like, I
No.
guess you're going to like the town, like, let's say, do we have to go to the crackpots, or is there, in your field, is there people just over the status quo that are identifiable?
There are, but I think what you have to do is you have to build in the very principles we're arguing here. You have to build in merit. You have to build in free speech. You have to build in open inquiry. That's the way you guard against the biases of the community. And you have to, and I mean that, you have to require people that be appointed on merit. The quality, not whether they're right wing or left wing, or whether what they're working on necessarily goes against the grain. It's some way of assessing their intellectual capabilities and their likelihood to be good professors and good teachers. And so I think that the best safeguards you can have are the safeguards that we're calling for, and that also means constantly questioning.
Yeah.
Constantly questioning whether you're doing the right thing, and using empirical evidence to guide not just public policy, but the policies in the university. Like affirmative action, is it doing anything? Is affirmative action actually doing anything? Is it achieving what it meant to? And looking and see it. When you see it isn't, then you change.
It's striking just hearing you talk, how much we used to revere these principles. Like growing up, like these are what our ideals that we aimed for, and what, it's crazy how fast they've 180'd, and just how suddenly, yeah, I can see how important it is to advocate for these things you're saying,
Yeah,
is that,
I think. I mean, there may be other things you can do, and I think it's important for the community to constantly be skeptical of itself, just like individual scientists should be. Department should say, are we open up enough to the broad spectrum? There was a time when all physics departments were hiring with string theorists, and people said, well, there's other parts of physics. Maybe you should open up. So I think it's important that we all ask ourselves those questions, and the community be open enough in a faculty meeting or everyone else to ask questions that may not be politically correct.
yeah.
So,
Okay, well, Lawrence, I know I'm really respectful of your time. I just leave you with one last question here, maybe, and I guess, what makes you hopeful for the future?
well, if I wasn't hopeful, I wouldn't have written the book. And this,
Yeah, you obviously have optimism.
I
Yeah.
think the tide, to some extent, is turning, but it's going to be a while. And as my wife used to say to me, it's going to get worse before it gets better, and sometimes it does. But I can already see that members of the public are beginning to see some of this and say, this is nonsense. And we're beginning to see, obviously, government pushback. But there's a long way to go. But I'm hopeful because 39 scientists were willing to speak out. And I'm hopeful because I see ideas beginning to be challenged. And I see people who've suffered because of what they're saying, at least beginning to have a platform. And so I'm hopeful because ultimately I think education, I've said this many times, but there's a famous saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I'm an educator. And so I ultimately think when the public and academics are educated, because most people don't realize some of the crazy things that are going on, even academics, they'll do something. And, and I see academics beginning to, as bad as things are in the United States with what's going on in science, some of them are realizing, maybe we should have spoken up so that we weren't all labeled that way. And I think, so I think the tide is slowly turning, and it often happens. The pendulum swings swings too much in one direction or another.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I have faith that and it's faith more than anything, that when people are educated and know the facts, that ultimately people will move in a good direction. That's why I believe in education. That's why I believe in science. And so I think there is hope, but we need to act because there are real challenges and things are being hurt, and the future of children and our society is endangered. And so it's not an easy road by any means.
Hear. Yeah, thanks again, Lawrence, for all your work. And the book is an amazing contribution. And thank you for taking the time to come on Bad Canadians. We really appreciate it.
Well, I do appreciate it. I appreciate what you're doing. And as my late friend, the Nobel laureate Stephen Weinberg, who like me was an atheist and an open atheist, would say, "You're doing God's work."
Well, we'll leave it at that then. Yeah. Okay. You have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe or share with your friends. Bad Canadians, Working Class Roots, A Free Speech Lens, and Canadian Contrarians.